Hello, good evening. Welcome to the Crowley Theater. I want to take a moment to thank Tim Crowley, Rob Crowley, and Emily Williams for their support of this program and all the other programs that take place here in the theater. Speaking of other programs, this Tuesday, In Front of Us film series will present two films, a feature and a short film. The feature is Simone Barbès, or Virtue, made in 1980 by the French filmmaker Marie-Claude Treillieu. And we will also be showing Le Man Négative from 1979, which is a film by Marguerite Duras. This is a film program which has already been shown at the ICA in London, and it's a program for which Eileen Myles, one of our two guests tonight, has written notes, and these notes will be available at the theater on Tuesday at 7:30 when we screen the film. They're also available at the ICA's website, and I really recommend you reading them. It's fantastic Eileen Myles writing about these which I haven't seen them yet, but seem very excellent films. So hope you, if you are still in town, you'll come and visit us at 7:30 on Tuesday for that program. We are here this evening to celebrate the publication of Turret Tops and Before, a book which addresses the work of Leeza Meksin. Leeza is an artist who we met during her Chinati Artist in Residency in 2019. She presented an incredibly beautiful exhibition at the Locker Plant here in Marfa. This book takes a particular body of work called the Turret Tops, which were made for the De Cordova Sculpture Center as the sort of central organizing work, but then it also focuses or includes a lot of earlier works that were made, I think, between about 2011 and recently. It's a very beautifully designed book, and it's a very generous book, and it's a really good, I think, introduction to the sort of scope of Leeza's work, which involves aspects of painting and architecture and all kinds of interesting elements, really. It's sort of difficult to pin down, but in a very beautiful and interesting and provocative way. There's also several really beautiful texts about Leeza's work here, and one of them is written by Eileen Myles, who joins us this evening. To round it out, Leeza is now living in Ithaca, New York, where she teaches at Cornell University. And she is also the co-founder and co-director of Ortega y Gasset, which is an artist-run gallery in Brooklyn. And Leeza will be joined on stage by Eileen Myles, who, as you probably know, is a poet-novelist based in New York and Marfa. They are the author of I Must Be Living Twice, Chelsea Girls, Inferno, many other fantastic books, and they were in 2021 elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters. So please join me in welcoming Eileen Myles and Leeza Meksin.
Thanks. Hi. This is so great. And it's so great that you guys are all here and that we have this show going on behind us that you are totally familiar with. I just, for some reason, I had the impulse because I thought we both just arrived and this, it's sort of part of Marfa is either being here or just gotten here or just leaving, and I just woke up this morning and had that sensation like, where am I? And then slowly I was like, oh, I'm in Marfa, and the bathroom is there, and I was so relieved to be awake because I had just had this terrible dream in which I felt like in the dream I was being asked to organize something that had to do with an event today in Marfa that was about the shooting. And I just like, I can't do it because I'm having a conversation with you and we're having this, and it was just too much. It was way too much. And then suddenly Eric Adams was there and he said, no, today's too soon. It'll be next week. And I thought, oh no, I won't be in Marfa next week. And I was having so much anxiety. And then I woke up and then it was today. And I took Honey for a walk and slowly, and then I've been thinking about your work all day and I'm really, really here now. And I wonder, because there's so much travel in your work and there's so much migration, and I think in your life too. And so I just wondered how you are, how you got here, and we'll talk.
I love that. Thank you, and thank you so much to all of you. It's so joyous for me to be here after, being away for, oh my gosh, has it been 3 years already? It feels like I was just here, but so yeah, I got here, it was like a day-long journey, and one of my closest friends, Andrea, and her daughter, Fran, met me in El Paso. They flew in from LA. I flew in from Syracuse. And we drove to El Paso in the middle of the night and arrived really early in the morning. And then had that kind of disorienting sleep with the blackout shades, and woke up in the afternoon, well into the afternoon, and then had a very nice and relaxing day at the pool, just soaking it all in. It's Andrea's and Fran's first time in Marfa, and so I get to actually show them around and feel like I, have a piece of this place to share. So it's been really wonderful.
I feel really lucky that I've both met you when you did the Chinati thing. And I think I showed this to you earlier, that at the time, get my props in order. When I met you, you gave me this, which is so weird. It's like, it's actually it's an Egyptian hieroglyph for clothing, and that's like the cover of the book. And I do think that there's a way. I mean, that's language, and I wonder. That was the first thing I thought about. To what extent are these turret tops language? Does that mean anything to you at all?
Absolutely. No, I love that. I mean, I thought a lot about this idea of dressing and how the body is marked by cloth. And when I was working on kind of coming up with the idea for the turret tops, before I knew what they were going to be, I was deep into researching Egyptian hieroglyphs. And but I didn't stumble on that particular hieroglyph until after the turret tops were already installed. So it was almost like discovering them instead of like finding them and using them as inspiration, it was like I saw them afterwards and realized that that was part of the work. Mm-hmm. And that's when I started drawing them. So they weren't like preparatory drawings, they were drawings after the, and that's actually one of the things I enjoy most about working site specifically, is that there's a lot of subconscious things happening and a lot of kind of like adrenaline rush and stress. And then afterwards, the work starts to reveal itself and makes me see things differently. Mm-hmm. And I think language works in a similar way. I mean, that's maybe, like I love rereading books that I loved once because they're different every time you read them, and makes you aware of how different you are, mm-hmm. and how you've moved from that point in time. Mm-hmm. But also, language is very loaded for me because I came to the United States when I was 12 from Soviet Russia, and I didn't know any English. And so I remember vividly this kind of shift where I was suddenly very struck by how arbitrary language is, that, we believe that a chair is called a chair for some inherent reason, but, how could it also be stool in Russian? Like the sort of doubling and the kind of meta-narrative of language, how it hovers above or in some kind of relationship to the real, mm-hmm. Was really interesting to me. And that's when I first started making, like a lot of my early works was actually based on letter forms. Mm. So like mixing Russian letter forms or Cyrillic with the English alphabet, and just thinking about what does the image of the text convey before we could read the text itself.
Wow. And I think that's the magic of language too, mm-hmm. Because there are all these other historical meanings in the making of the letter itself. What's the link between, I'm not sure if people have bought your book and are excited about your work, but probably don't even necessarily know what this project is. So do you want to tell them exactly?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's see. So the De Cordova Sculpture Park and Museum is in Lincoln, Massachusetts, which is about 20 minutes outside of Boston. And Sarah Montrose, the curator there, invited me to propose a site-specific project for the park, for the sculpture park. And I went there and, just walked around, looked around, and I typically always work with existing structures. So the fabric attaches to existing architecture, either on the outside or the inside, but kind of, I think of it as architectural drag or outfits for buildings. But in this case, they were asking me to do something on the grounds of the park. So it had to be self-supporting, it had to have its own structure. But I still wanted it to be about architecture in some way. So I was looking at the building, and the De Cordova is a really funny kind of mishmash of styles. So it was originally this summer cottage, with scare quotes, because it's more like a Normandy castle. But the De Cordovas, who are glass merchants, I believe, they visited Europe on their travels and just fell in love with kind of the Normandy style castle and wanted to transplant it to New England. So they built this very, not New England-like structure, and then later donated it to the town of Lincoln. And then once it became a museum, they kind of quickly outgrew it, and in the 80s and early 90s, added this very kind of somewhat boring and, very maybe 90s addition to the structure that doesn't seem to go with the Normandy theme at all. And the only thing that connects them is the brick facade. So they covered it in brick, and so visually it kind of seems to belong together, but the styles are completely at odds with each other. But what was really interesting to me were these turrets, that this Normandy castle had these pair of turrets, and they immediately looked bodily to me and kind of reminded me of the symmetry of the body, and they were breast-like, and they threw this very provocative shadow onto the ground. So they're kind of pointy, but the shadow they threw looked really voluptuous, like the building has breasts. And so, of course, that really captivated me, and I started to think, what does it mean to remake the turrets, to kind of behead the building symbolically and take, if you think of them as heads, and to put them on the ground. So I started researching the turrets and the whole construction, and realized that they were, from the very beginning, kind of designed to be unusable dead space. And that was really interesting to me because they're such feminine forms, so the kind of decorative quality of them seemed to imply to the architect that they should be useless, essentially. So they were just purely there for decoration, and when you look up at them from the ground, they seem kind of small and dainty. But once I measured them, I realized that they're quite large. So to have that much, articulated space be useless seemed like an odd choice. And you also can't enter them. So they're over 20 feet tall and over 20 feet in diameter. So I wanted to bring that kind of dysmorphic scale down to earth, kind of to make people who are walking around make that connection, that scale up in the building reads very differently than when you're actually on the ground and you could enter these shapes. So that was kind of the beginning of my thinking, and then I also wanted them to be both dwelling and body. And so that's when I started to think about what signifies the body and how could their entrances be also orifices, and could they be dressed up, right? So they're made of neoprene, that's their kind of skin or flesh, and the outer layers are the outfit. That's how I thought of them. So the outfit is made out of glide skin, which is supposed to be this kind of protective layer, but ironically, it was the layer that aged the most, or maybe that makes sense, right? It protected the neoprene, and it got these like crazy wrinkles and kind of delta-like rivulets all throughout them. It cracked, like the sun and the snow really did a number on this glide skin. But it protected the neoprene, and it also created this kind of like in-process painting. So the bleaching that occurred over time eventually was revealed. So the outfits were removed, and the turret tops became naked in my mind. This is kind of how I thought of it. And they had these sort of bikini tans, but really not tans, more like bleach marks. And actually, while I was here in Marfa, I did a lot of the experimentation of seeing how quickly neoprene bleaches outdoors. So I did all these little paintings. I strapped them down outside in my studio, and they just were there for, maybe 5 weeks. And of course, the Texan sun was a lot more dramatic than the sun in Massachusetts, but it gave me an idea of what to expect and how long these things could last, right? And so yeah, I think that's maybe in a nutshell.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's something that the architecture itself is so interesting. I mean, like you say, that the turrets had no purpose; they were just useless. And I think reading through the catalog, I think somebody's essay talked about Adolf Loos, some modernist architecture critic, just talking about how contemptible ornament is in architecture, which I thought that's so great. It's like that's so modernism, but also it's like it does lead into the gender thing, because it was just that level of contempt had to do with a space that didn't have a purpose, that was considered waste, that was ornamental, and it was so antithetical to modernism, and it seems so interesting and exciting that that's exactly the detail that you would be, because I guess the turrets went from being fortifications early on to just imitations of fortifications to we don't like that at all anymore. And literally he used the word, we have outgrown that, which I thought was so powerful and so telling too. So do you want to talk, I mean, like somebody talked about your work was addressing the gendered boundaries of genre and discipline. And do you want to talk, I mean, it's a very obvious question, but I think it's so interesting. It's like, first of all, what do you think gender is? I mean, I was on a panel recently with everybody trans, and I was making some claims for some idea about gender, and they were like, what do you think gender is? And I was like, and I wonder what your, because it isn't about, well, I won't. Tell me what you think.
Thanks for throwing me under that bus.
How about really?
It's a big one. I mean, I think about it a lot, and I'm really interested in gender binaries and kind of the falseness in the binary, right? That there's this expectation of difference, but so many things evade that binary, and I think trans is like such a huge thing that is battling the binary kind of falseness of gender. So, I mean, gender has been like very much of concern to me since I was a little kid. And I remember, reading adventure novels as a little girl and wishing to be a boy because I always envisioned myself as the protagonist, not the girl that was being saved, by the protagonist. And so I would introduce myself as Seryoja, which is a Russian boy's name, a diminutive of Sergei. And I was kind of a tomboy and had short hair and could, pass for Seryoja. But then I hit puberty, and that was really painful because I was like, oh, I can't really pass for Seryoja anymore. And also was just kind of became aware of, why was I so uncomfortable with my body as a woman, and it took me a really long time to find my footing with it. But it, it continued throughout my life, like in college and grad school, and this kind of like tension, this idea that certain things are perceived as feminine and that like objects and materials have a kind of inherent gender, and how that inherent gender is connected to the falsity of the binary, right? So it's like fabric seems really feminine. Why? Oh, it's soft and it's flowy and it's hard to control. But if you stretch that fabric on a panel or a stretcher, then suddenly it gets structure and shape, and and somehow that structure elevates it to a more refined form. And so that's sort of, I was really interested in painting, but I was really annoyed that painting seemed to want to neutralize the fact that so much of painting happens on fabric, right? That we kind of want to delete that fact and hide the fabric, because what's more important is the structure and the kind of borders, how the borders meet the world and what it excludes and includes. And then, of course, architecture is also, there's so much inherent gender in architecture, both because of the type of materials that are being used, hard, long-lasting, respectable, but also because it's been such a male-dominated field, and still is even today, and also this kind of like straight line, right angle quality of architecture, that most buildings are very straight, in all the meanings of that word. So that's sort of the thinking that led me to wanting to queer architecture with fabric, using fabric to kind of tweak the gender of buildings and think about buildings as bodies, and our relationship as bodies that are very different than buildings, right? Like we don't have a single straight line or right angle in our body, yet most of the buildings we inhabit are all straight lines and right angles. So I wonder how that contributes to a certain feeling of, I don't know, insecurity or maybe even self-loathing, where like our bodies are not good enough or not ideal enough to match the type of dwellings we build for ourselves. And of course, teepees or caves or, yurts. There's so many examples of dwellings from earlier on that didn't rely on straight lines and box-like structures. So I'm really interested in thinking about how the dwellings we inhabit start to interact with our ideas of what is good and bad in our bodies, kind of the shaming of what the body actually is, the fact that it ages, the fact that it has a very different scale, time scale than buildings typically do. And that also relates to like the type of things you usually see in sculpture gardens, right? Those art objects are made of bronze and steel and marble and granite, all of these materials that have inherent implied gender and are also meant to last. They're meant to make us feel that even though we'll age and die, that maybe something will be left unchanged. But of course, all of those materials also change. They just change at a different scale. So we're like lying to ourselves to say that it's not going to change, or it's not going to die, it's going to be here for posterity. Well, maybe it'll be here in 500 years, but I doubt it'll be here in 1,000,000, So with the fabric pieces in the sculpture garden, I really wanted to see what it would feel like to witness aging, to witness materials age, and feel like sorry for an art object, or feel compassion for an art object, or feel like an art object is displaced, is in the wrong spot. Like, how could you leave this outdoors? And I had a lot of anxiety about that as it was the pandemic, so I couldn't even go visit it. And there was just a lot of like waking up in a cold sweat and being like, it's snowing in Massachusetts. So even though I was interested to see how it changes, I still was continuously stressed by its aging.
I know I immediately, because they look like teepees, because it's Massachusetts, I immediately pounced on the indigenous question, and I noticed that Pam Sneed did that too. But what's so interesting about what you're saying about the work and letting the work fall apart reminds me of this thing I had heard that maybe everybody's heard. I think there were certain artifacts and bones, Native American bones that were at the Smithsonian that these tribes were petitioning for a long time, and they just couldn't get them, and the Smithsonian was like, no, this is really, and eventually they realized the Smithsonian had no case, and they had to give it back to the tribe. And magnificently what the tribe then did was they put the artifacts just on top of a mesa and just left them out there to rot and fall apart. And it was just like, wow. When I read that, I was like, I've never heard about anything that beautiful. And again, it's a spiritual gesture, which I think opens out, in your work too. I think the fact of creating something that is not supposedly lasting, but is changing. Again, it goes back to gender too, because I think everything we're talking about binary and non-binary, it's just like gender is language, and language is change, and it is constantly shifting. But I think it totally is the part of the art that is not the artist's hand, and you're open to something else.
I love that. It's a lot to think about there. Yeah, in a funny way, I was so focused on remaking the turrets to scale that it wasn't until they were there in front of me that I was like, oh my gosh, these are teepees. And it was just like, oh my gosh, how did I miss that one? I felt really blindsided. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like, yeah, that makes sense, because they're these dwellings that you could enter, and they resonate with the scale of the human body, as opposed to so many buildings that we find ourselves in that kind of dwarf the scale of the human body. And this, I think, the spirituality in a lot of Native American thinking about the cyclicity.
Why not? Yeah, that sounds
let's
good
go
to
with
me.
it. Thank you. This sort of, the flow of things, and that you don't need to hold so tightly onto land, property, bones, that there is a kind of like, they have their own place in this sort of cycle of life.
And they return. They return. And so, it's so interesting that you spotted that in the turrets too, on a certain level, because it's like when you go to that wasted space that is ludicrous and then do something to it or with it, you almost call it out. You almost call out its power in that sort of interiority that supposedly is nothing. And I think, looking at your work and comparing it to like Christo and Jean-Claude, and whenever you read about their work, they're always talking about that it's covering. We covered this and we covered that. Often they're things that, there's a castration in it. Whether it's a natural space, we're covering this island, or we're covering these gates that people then can go through. And I don't think the word cover really has any relationship to your work. I don't think covering is what you're doing at all. I think you're kind of releasing the inside.
Oh, I love that. The kind of irony that clothing is showing something that's on the inside by covering what's on the outside is something that I think about a lot, right? That even when a person is making a deliberate choice to not cultivate a certain style, that choice becomes a style and is legible. It says something about that person. And so it's like the the idea that we're covering ourselves in something, but it's actually an act of revealing, is really interesting to me. So I think the covering, I never think of it as a kind of like cloaking. It's more of a shifting of, and a revealing of its identity, and just the masquerade of it, right? That the playfulness, that if a brick building is suddenly wearing a spandex outfit, there's just like something humorous in that, and ill-fitting, and there's something humorous to spandex outfits on humans too. So I love the kind of gaucheness of spandex and the way that it challenges elegance and certain norms of taste.
And you're flirting with architecture. It's performative on your part as an artist, I think. I found something really weird. I mean, I think it may be just making the same point that we're making, but there was something really weird that I read in the Quran that I've been reading it incredibly slowly, and it's really good. But this is like, there is no blame on elderly women who are past the age of marriage if they take off their outer clothing without revealing their adornments. Isn't that weird? And I think what they're really talking about is female genitalia as adornments, or female beauty as adornments. But again, it's sort of like this projection of the actual fact of female existence as being entirely exterior, and almost, you know what I mean, like in the same way that like a woman should be covered because otherwise, I'll be tempted to flirt with her or do something. But it's sort of like, but again, it's an entire projection of my interiority onto your exteriority, and I think it's even embedded in the language, and I think in the religion in some way.
Wow. Yeah. Can you read that line again?
Yes. It does. I don't know if it gets any better, but there is no blame on elderly women who are past the age of marriage if they take off their outer clothing without. And I think it was a section of all these laws in which women were allowed to undress in this situation, but not allowed to undress in this situation. But elder women can basically do anything they want as long as they don't reveal their adornments. It's just like, oh my God. But it's just, again, it's just like the othering of the female gender, which makes it all be exterior, And I think, again, to think about how you've dealt with this building, which is so beautiful and ludicrous, and it's sort of faux masculinity. And then you're kind of like, no, come on out and show me what you really are, by projecting it onto the land and making it something you can enter, because the fact of the building was that you couldn't go in, as as a real feature of it. Have I created the silent moment?
Well, I'm still pondering that sentence and the sort of the implied blame that exists in the sentence, right?
Exactly.
And that the clothing in itself is not an adornment, right? The adornment is underneath the clothing.
So the very fact of the woman is the
adornment.
The adornment,
yes.
Yeah, which is very strange.
Very interesting.
Yeah. There's a whole category of public decoration besides you and Christo, which is Christmas. Like suddenly there's certain parts of cities where everybody gets out their Christmas thing, their public installation. Or when did buildings start lighting up for holidays? That was a fairly late thing, and I guess I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the whole public spectacle of like, who else does this and why?
It is so funny that you say that, because that just reminded me of this debacle that happened with a project I did in 2011 in St. Louis. It was called Housecoat, and so there was this kind of ugly Betty of a building, like a row house in a part of St. Louis that, like artists were moving to, but it was a lot of boarded up row houses, and all of the neighboring houses were boarded up. But two artists were living in this building, or rather an artist and her partner. And so the artist, Lauren Frances Adams, put out a call to, her artist friends, saying, I want to do an exterior gallery on this building. I live inside the building, my studio is inside the building. I don't have space to have a gallery inside, but I want to activate the outside of the building as a public gallery that's always open. So send proposals. And as soon as I saw the picture of the building, I was like, spandex outfit. You gotta have a little spandex makeover. I had a vision. And, I proposed it, she loved it. She didn't own the building, so she ran it past her landlord. And I think, when you speak in these abstractions of like spandex outfit for a building, people are like, cool, I don't know what you mean, but I guess so. So like the landlord agreed. But then, once we actually, I had this spandex printed. This was actually one of the only times I printed my own design on spandex because, again, of the scale, right? That most fabric is, the pattern is printed with the human scale in mind. But I knew that if, you stretch it over an architectural scale, that it kind of optically mixes and stops being a recognizable pattern and becomes more of a color. So I wanted to print something that would be large enough to be readable on that scale. And so I arrived there with like 11 bolts of spandex and in a van that I rented and drove. And actually my friend Andrea flew in from LA and met me there and was like supporting me in every way then. And so to relate it to your awesome question, so we started, busily putting this outfit together, and it was just like a real learning experience. It was one of those things that if I knew what I was into, I probably would have never done it. And it was really overwhelming. And then, the fire department showed up, and the police showed up, and the city showed up, and they're all like, they all had different questions and different demands. Like the fire department was like, I guess this is fine first they were like, this is a, fire hazard. And I was like, no, spandex is a fire retardant. It actually look, like if you light it, it just fizzles out, it just melts and then creates a little border. So it's like, it's actually good. And they're like, all right, but you need, an escape route. You can't just cover a building and not have any escape route. So I was like, all right, let's put an escape ladder out of the second story window. And that actually ended up being like one of my favorite parts of the project, which I, would have never done if the fire department didn't force me to think about an escape window. But the city was the funniest part because they made me come down to the city with a little, kind of maquette of the house that I had made because so much of the ideation for the project had to happen long distance. So I had this little scale model made to kind of figure out how the outfit is going to sit on this building. And so I brought it to City Hall, and I'm talking to this official who's just like, you're doing what? And then he was like, well, you need a permit. And I'm like, that's fine. I'm happy to pay for a permit. Like, I just don't shut me down. And he's like, okay, well, let me figure this out. And so he's going through like the permit language and is getting more and more kind of like short and irritable. And I'm just like, I'm willing to purchase whatever permit, just like, what do you need? And he's like, well, it doesn't really fit under any one of the permits because like it's not decoration, it's not like Christmas lights because it covers more than a certain percentage. Like each of these permits had very specific kind of like legalese language that essentially saved me from having to buy a permit because he was just like, well, it's not advertisement because it's not saying anything. It doesn't have language explicitly in it, and it's not decoration because it covers more of the building than decoration does. And so that he just went through all of it, and then he just like threw his arms up in frustration and was just like, I guess you're good to go. He was really annoyed. So I didn't end up having to buy a permit, and miraculously they let it go on and happen. But the story didn't have a happy ending because the landlords got wind of it and were like, this is not what we signed up for. This is really insulting.
Why was it not?
Well, I don't know what again, it's like when they heard about it, they had a certain image in their heads that didn't match what it actually looked like. And it's interesting that they owned this building, but they lived in like a suburb of St. Louis, so they didn't live in the city, and they actually lived across the border in this neighboring state that it must be Illinois. Sorry, my geography is. But anyway, so they were close enough, but they were like kind of out of what this neighborhood is actually like. And they had all these projections about why my project was like insulting to the neighborhood. But I was actually out there talking to the neighborhood every day, to everybody who came by, and everybody wanted to talk about it, and it actually was very much like a linguistic project in my head. Like I had a running list of things that people thought it was. So, people would come in and be like, what is this? And I'd be like, well, what do you think it is? And then they would say something, and then I would put it on this list. So just this kind of Rorschach test of like, what do you see? I mean, what is it, and kids loved it. It was very like fantastical, and you could touch it. Like there was no nose about it, right? There was no sort of like, no, this is an art piece, don't touch it. So kids were like having a blast with pulling on it and playing with it. And I think overall it was very much fun for the community to interact with it. But these landlords were so mad about it, and it was like really
so interesting.
Yeah, they really got under their skin.
What were they mad at? It's so weird. I think the insulting to the neighborhood feels like up there with the adornments on the woman's body, which is like it's a total projection. Yes. It's like insulting to me, and so it's kind of the building must be phallic, and somehow you, woman artist, are covering, my thing. It's got to be, because what else could it be? Because it's not the neighborhood.
I know.
It's him.
And actually, my friends ended up moving out of the building. Like I mean, they were so brave and amazing about it, and I felt terrible. But it, kind of like the turret tops too. That I never got to see it again after I left House Code, thinking I'll be back in a certain amount of time for the closing and disrobing of it. But it had to come down before I could get back because of all of this kind of legal issues with the landlords. And my friends were so outraged that they were like, well, we're leaving too. We can't be part of this.
Right.
So, but I felt terrible that they lost their home. But they were like, we're fighting for House Code. So it became like an activist gesture, which,
wow.
It wasn't, I mean, there was a lot of ideas of gentrification and whitewashing in the project because it was white spandex with huge gold chains printed on it, and I kind of thought about how the scale of a chain totally changes its meaning, that like a small chain is a necklace, it's adornment, and a big chain is, imprisonment, and so it was definitely playfully talking about lots of difficult questions. What does it mean that this is an artist-run space that is essentially, helping the gentrification of this neighborhood? But I think...
What do you mean by helping the gentrification?
Well,
positive, negative?
It's...
Shaping it.
It's shaping it, yeah. That it's promoting a certain change in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of the neighbors were, because there was, the project got a lot of kind of local press, like a lot of, like the St. Louis TV station and all the local newspapers were like coming out. They were like, oh, spandex out for a building, and so there was a lot of buzz around it. And so the people in the neighborhood were talking about how interesting it was to see a different kind of attention happening in this neighborhood. That mm-hmm. like, so, again, there was so many things that I didn't consciously think I was saying mm-hmm. until the neighborhood and the community informed me of what all of the things that they're seeing, right? And kind of this running list was expanding, and burqa came up, but also wedding veil came up, so it was like Ku Klux Klan came up, that like the hood, because it was white and it was kind of hiding the eyes of the house. And so it was just very dramatic shifts in perception. People saw an ocean liner and a wedding cake or layered cake, or some thought that it was about Tiffany's, like the jewelry store, and some thought that it was about incarceration and like talking about, the prison complex system. So just the wide range of associations were like miraculous to me.
Yeah, like you created a discourse in the neighborhood about the neighborhood and the neighborhood's unconscious, which is so great. I don't know where we're at all. I guess maybe do we have any questions? I think maybe people want to, because otherwise I have, I'm all I'm thinking is Baroque, but that's just taking us off into another tangent. What do people want to?
I love that. There are, yeah. Let's see if I could quickly.
Also, the name House Code is so good. That's
Thank
really
you.
great.
Yeah, I want, so here's the escape ladder. Let's see if there's another picture here. Maybe this way. This is kind of the side entrance. This was the only entrance that you could get into the building. And it didn't have, when I do these large-scale outfits on buildings, I never want to make holes in the structure, because I think of them as outfits, and so we don't nail our outfits to the body. So they're all kind of rigged up and held up by corsetting and, weights and like rigging. Yeah, that was some pictures of House Code. And House Code as a title came to me because of its sort of gendered associations, right? That it's like an outfit you wear indoors, and it's a sort of, outfit that you shouldn't go outside in. It's a house coat, but in this case, it was for the house, so it had to be outside in order for it to wear it. So just, playing with language.
And it's a little lower class too. House Code is not a, ruling class. You wear a gown if you're like, House Code is kind of schmata, sort of.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, that was a great question. Thank you. And I think that is very much in my blood. I kind of grew up on that aesthetic without realizing how specific it was. So it wasn't until I was here that I started looking back and being like, oh, this aesthetic is about a certain time and place that felt very neutral to me growing up, but really informed so much of my taste and also the way I thought about language, because so much of that aesthetic was kind of usurped by the propaganda machine of the Soviets, right? They were so, on the one hand, they were really invested in like very realist painting as a kind of way to show, the people's way of life. But on the other hand, they usurped a lot of the supremacist language and the constructivists as a way to make very effective banners and propaganda statements. And I always think, in my school cafeteria in Moscow, there was a huge long banner that said, "We wash our hands."
Mike Kelly.
Right? And it's just like, it really stayed with me, and I would like turn that phrase over in my head and think about all of the things that it's actually saying, right? Like, we wash our hands of what? And so like when I was in grad school studying painting, but a lot of the painting I was doing at the time was word-based. So I actually made a huge painting that said, "We wash our hands." So there was a lot of thinking about propaganda and how that moment of text turning into image is actually really effective tool for propaganda. So you kind of accept the language more readily. But yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's where my mind went when you asked. So I definitely think that I can't escape that heritage, and also my grandfather was an architect, and so there was a lot of talk. I grew up in his house, and there was a lot of talk about the kind of like maybe relating to what you were saying about Adolf Loos, this idea that the arts have a hierarchy, right? That, like, according to the modernists at least, drafting is much more important than color. And my grandfather would always be like, "You gotta work on your drawing, you gotta strengthen your hand. Like, the color, you got it down, like, that's just your thing. But the drawing, you gotta work on the drawing." And for years, I hated drawing because I just felt like, I suck at this. I'm really a bad draftsman. And it wasn't until grad school where I was like, oh, I could draw the way I draw. Like, I don't have to be a draftsman. And that, that's also when I started questioning, like, well, what is it about color that makes it less important than line and structure and form, and kind of going back to this idea of, a painting is on canvas, but it's stretched on a rectangle. So what's more important, the properties of the fabric or the shape, the rigid shape of the support? So obviously, I don't think that there's hierarchies apply, and I think those hierarchies are very gendered. I think we could talk about color and apply all of the language that is pejoratively used towards women, towards people of color, towards ethnicities, towards queer people, right? So it's like color is dangerous because it's much harder to control. And that's what I love about color, right? That it's just a phenomenon unto itself, and I could be alongside of it and learn something from it every time I'm confronted with it, as opposed to this idea of mastering something. Thank you.
Are we there? A final thought from one of you brilliant people? No, I think we're great, right?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.